Today, I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts about the impact of all of this. I'm not going to go into a ton of technical detail on how we do things and the methods behind the data analytics, mostly because we sort of did that last time, and I don't want to just repeat the same stuff over and over. I will give you a brief introduction if you haven't heard anything about what nPlan is, but the principle of what I want to try and do today is talk really about the next generation, like what happens as a result of all of this. And some of this is, and not some of this, all of this is actually evidence that we have seen through our work. And what I want you all to take out of this is to really understand what drives these behaviors, what drives these changes, and what you can do in your day-to-day jobs to either enact these changes yourselves or encourage others to do that. So it's certainly a mission of inspiration that I want to get across to you today. As a very quick summary, and I am not going to dwell on this too much, but what does nPlan do? This is the one simple photograph that I have of what we do. We produce machine learning algorithms that can read and understand schedules or programs or Gantt charts. These are most typically in the form of an XER file or an XML file, and they're created using software like Oracle's Primavera P6 or Microsoft Project. Needless to say, this is what every construction project around the world uses to plan their work. We create a plan, and then every month we diligently check how we're doing against the plan as we build the project. And what's beautiful about this data analytics challenge is that all of that data gets stored. It gets stored in these archives that are incredibly tedious to try and sift through. In my past life, I worked for Shell as a project manager. But when I was a graduate at Shell, I had the unglamorous task of combing through a P6 database that had hundreds of thousands of files inside it to try and calculate what is the mean time to engineer a compressor. I can tell you that was not a highlight of my career, but it's those, call it lowlights. And Martin mentioned at the start of this call that there are some apprentices in the call. By the way, I'm not trying to link my lowlight to an apprentice. What I would say is that the time I spent combing through P6 databases thinking that, this sucks, to put it bluntly, was when I learned really the foundations of what has become nPlan today. So when it does seem tedious, the way you should, and I didn't have the foresight to think of it back then. I didn't think that, oh, maybe we should build a company that can actually read all this data autonomously and make sense of it and provide us all this interesting information in a nice, intelligent way. Sounds kind of obvious when I'm saying it now, but I didn't think of it back then. So what nPlan does is we read these gigantic databases. We do this now for 24 clients around the world. A client for us is an organization that typically spends over $1 billion on construction projects annually. We go in dollars just because of internationalization, but $1 billion annually, have been doing it for 10 years and have shared all of their historical data with nPlan. The last being obviously the hardest thing that has to happen. And what comes out of it is essentially the reason why they share this data, which is we produce quantitative forecasts of projects. In effect, you can, by now the system has read just north of $850 billion in construction spend, north of 450,000 projects have been through this. So one simple way of describing it is this algorithm is the world's most experienced construction planner. But in a slightly different way. So I don't want you to imagine a planner and now an algorithm and try and think that this is taking over all the planners. That's not at all what we're talking about. What really, if you think about, like, if you in your businesses, if you meet a really experienced person, someone that's seen it all and been there and done that, you don't ask them to, like, all right, could you start creating the plan for me then? What you will do is you create the plan, and ask the experienced people, hey, what do you think of this? Where do you think I might go wrong in this plan? And that packages up into something called assurance. And assurance has existed on projects for longer than I've been around. And what we're saying here, what we're trying to replace and change is that now we believe that schedule assurance or program assurance can be done algorithmically. This means instead of relying on the limited experience you have inside the business, you can actually rely on hundreds of thousands of projects from around the world to tell you how your project is probably going to perform and what might go wrong with it. I've written a little link at the bottom of the slide, kdd2020.nplan.io. This is actually something quite new for us. And I have to be careful of not diving too deep into the technical detail here. A hard thing about producing forecasts is that it's in the future, right? So imagine you put your project schedule through nPlan and then it tells you these are the things that are going to happen. Well, the reality is those things are in the future. So how do you know that the forecast is correct? And because it's a machine learning algorithm, it would be pretty stupid if the machine created a forecast of something in the future and had no way of knowing if the forecast it creates is correct. That is literally not artificial intelligence. Intelligence is the process involved when you say something and you have a feedback loop possible, right? And so definitionally, if we want to be saying that we use artificial intelligence to do our job, there are two parts to it. One part is understand the schedule data going in, that that deluge of schedule files coming in. There's a cool bit of technology, machine learning technology, to understand that. Then the second part is to make, once you produce forecasts, you have to be able to generate loops that can understand whether or not you're generating the right kind of forecasts. That is the field that we've had to make huge strides on, because it simply isn't something that we could just say, oh yeah, let's just copy what Google did here or what Facebook did there. This is truly novel and cutting edge technology that we've had to literally invent to be able to calibrate a machine learning model in probabilistic forecasting. So if you're more technically inclined, I encourage you to go to that website. If you're not technically inclined, don't bother. I don't understand the website myself, so don't worry there. All of this, of course, our users are not machine learning engineers. Our users are normal project controls professionals from around the world that speak different languages, care about slightly different things. And so we like to create beautiful imagery, beautiful visualizations that they can interact with. Just really quickly, the one on the right, this progress curve here is one that I have a lot of personal passion for. And that's because when I was a project manager in my old life, I used to see progress curves being submitted that would have a magical kink upwards that we're delayed now, but don't worry, we're going to catch up. And I'll be like, okay. And inevitably, we never would. So we never had a sense of realism for our projects, but hopefully using data, you can really generate that. And that's going to be the core of what I'm going to share with you today. nPlan doesn't build itself. We have incredible women and men that work with us. This is a slightly dated photograph from clearly pre-lockdown, but we are now a team of 22 of the brightest people I know on the planet. Okay, so diving into the sort of like into the core of what we want to chat about. The main thing that I want to get over here is I want you to leave with an understanding of how and why change will occur beyond the data analytics part of this story. And we are going to be slightly complex for Martin, and we're going to go into Menti. So you can read the question here, and I'll say it out loud as well. And in the meantime, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Martin is magically going to put up the Menti screen, and we're going to see how all of you feel about this. Oh, that was really seamless. Okay, we need to move forward on the questions, all right? So the question is around how often do you feel contracts fairly apportion risk between the client and the contractor? And there are a couple of options for you down there. Never, sorry, the contractor takes all the grunt themselves. Always is, of course, nirvana. So it'd be interesting to see if at least someone thinks there's an always happening. but I would love to hear who you feel thinks is sitting on what side of the story here. We're not going to then ask you whether you are the people voting are from clients or contractors. We'll keep all of that side anonymous, but I think it's, I mean, clearly we're seeing a very heavy winner here. So a little bit sad that none of us think that we always fairly apportion risk. I guess that's a loaded question, and I knew that would happen. But 27 out of 40, 28 out of 40 think, most of us basically think that the contractor bears most of the risk, right? And if you've seen financial statements from contractors, this doesn't make sense, right? Why should the organization that is clearly, I mean, in general, not performing financially in a financially robust way, take all the risk? So let's unpack that a notch. We need to go back to my slides now. Sorry, Martin. Should I hit share screen on my end? See how I can do that. I should be back. So with so why does this end up happening, right? Like, so why is it that contractors end up bearing most of this risk? And together with some friends at the University of Cambridge and Harvard Business School, we've been exploring a lot of these concepts in construction economics. And there's a great book that I need to just pick off my shelf and show you. And of course, I can't find it on my shelf. Great. It is a book called Construction Economics. And I've forgotten the author. If someone knows the author, that I would appreciate just popping it into the chat. But if you're interested in construction economics, like I am, I geek out on these sort of things. It's super interesting to understand how contractors make money. I'm troubling myself in where I've lost the book now. But let's summarize the book on one slide. So you start with you start on the right hand side, which is clients drive price wars. I'm purposefully being a little harsh and with my words. I once worked for a client, so I think I should have some authority to say that. What ends up happening is that a client says, I want this built. Contractors, would you bid for it, please? And inevitably what they're doing is they're saying, I want the cheapest person to win the bid. If you're cheap, you win the work. Now, how does a contractor differentiate themselves from the other contractor? It's not like you can really say, I'm the better contractor, but I'm more expensive. Like, you're building it to the specifications we're telling you to build it at. So what truly differentiates them? The construction industry, each contractor has very little differentiation between them. Sure, they can pull out that they do project data analytics in their business, and that's what differentiates them. But really speaking, these things are still a drop in the ocean, and you're driving towards the lowest price. So what happens is contractors are inevitably forced to drive down their price to a point where it's just not realistic. They know it's never going to be done for that price and that time. And the project gets awarded to the cheapest contractor. And inevitably, you will end up with claims. Claims, and the true cost will emerge, right? You thought you were buying a fixed price contract for say $1 billion. At the end, if it costs you $2 billion, then you might as well have received a quote for $2 billion on day one. What I will say, it is always cheaper to know the final outcome of your project in advance. To go through the claims and true cost process, it is always inevitably more expensive because it is an organizationally inefficient thing to happen, and it quite simply is bad planning. Like, if you don't plan your project well, you're not going to deliver it in a very efficient way. Huge contributor to a drop and lack of productivity, frankly. So we're just not starting them very well, and then we end up in this awful situation where you have to claim for what frankly should have just been included in the original price. And that makes it very hard to create an incentive to improve. Like, why should the contractor now improve? What happens if one contractor out of 3 that are bidding on a project says, you know what, there's no way we're going to be able to do this for this price and this duration. You know, sure, you could stick your neck out, and at what cost? What happens if you lose the bid because, you know, you were the wise one doing it? And that this is the cycle. This is what makes it a very dangerous cycle for economics in this industry. And I firmly believe, and all the next slides are all about how data analytics can get us out of this horrible cycle that I hope we don't live in for much longer. And so for those of you that have some knowledge in disputes, this is basically when you know, you can't come to agreement on what the true price should be or who should own what risk, you end up in a dispute, and you end up battling it out. So disputes are not only increasing in duration, like how long it takes to resolve a dispute, which means the disputes themselves are becoming more complex, but also the volume, the price that is being fought after is increasing, which means we're trending towards a worse situation in that economic cycle that I just spoke of. We're going to go to another poll. So Martin, would you mind taking us back towards Menti, which is, why do you think the average length of disputes is increasing with time? And I'll stop sharing my screen as soon as I can do that. Oops, there's my Zoom on. Yep.
Can you see that okay, Dev?
Yep. Yeah. Back up. Yeah. Projects are becoming more complex. The information gap. Sorry if there are any lawyers in the room where I wrote lawyers are finding ways to extend claim processes. That's not intended to go and dagger towards a lawyer. But that's really interesting, right? So, you know, we see by the way, we are doing more projects is actually technically correct. The construction industry is larger than it's ever been in its history. But it's more interesting to see that we largely are talking about information gap between the client and the contractor. So we think that clients and contractors end up knowing that what knowledge each organization has is becoming further and further apart, which means contractors end up knowing less and less about the scope they're bidding on. Clients end up knowing less and less about the capability of the contractor doing the work. And this is an information gap, right? How can you award a contract to someone if you put it simply, don't know much about how they're going to do? And how can you sign a contract to deliver a scope of work if you don't know what all the risks are? Let me take us back towards, and of course, projects are becoming more complex, which is very true. Complex projects warrant are harder to arbitrate as well. So just like I magically predicted, I promise you I'm not the person voting. It's you, all of you who are attending are voting. Information asymmetry is what causes these problems. So what do we do about it, right? It's well and good telling you that there's a problem, but we have to find solutions to problems, not just complain about them. And the first step to this is a really simple, my slides, by the way, are very, very simple, is bidding for realism. Bidding for realism is how do we get the industry to a place where it is actually valued to bid to the correct outcome of the project. A really simple screenshot, quite literally, from nPlan is this. This is what is known as a probabilistic, this is a probability distribution function. This is basically saying what is the likelihood of different end dates occurring on a project. So you think of it as the schedule file has come in, it's gone through its analysis, and out comes a result. And this is one such result of, looks like quite a long project, right? It's going to finish in 2024-ish. But what's interesting on this is that the planned end date has no chance of being achieved, or like a 1% chance of being achieved. So it's sitting to the extreme left of this graph. The P50, the 50% probability that you're going to be able to hit that date, or you have a 50% chance of being on or before that date and a 50% chance of being on or after that date, is sitting at July of 2024. But actually there is some chance this project could extend all the way until May of 2025, right? April, May of 2025, which is the far right-hand side to this graph. Also, this is where black swan events live. This is the highly unlikely but deeply impactful outcomes of a project. So when we talk about bidding for realism, one of the things that we've been doing with one of our clients in Canada is talking about, well, the contractors have submitted a schedule to you. Do you know what likelihood the contractor has of delivering this project on time? And these are fixed price contracts. Where are you going to award the fixed price contract to? So right off the bat, if they award the fixed price contract to the planned end date based on this graph, they have no chance, the contractor has no chance of delivering the project on time, or 1%, right? So call it almost no chance. So inevitably, we're basically saying this graph means that you're going to enter liquidated damages claims, and that horrible process is just going to kick off again. So what can we do about this? One, it's effectively you have to try and work with the contractor to try and say, we understand what risks exist on the project. What is a fair distribution of these risks? Some of them are owned by the client, rightfully so, and some of them are owned rightfully by the contractor. Apportion them. So you start with saying, look, liquidated damages should not be incurred until percentile point X, right? And you could pick X as P50, P70, whatever risk threshold you want to set. It is later than you were hoping the project would finish at, but it is real. And then agree which risks should move to which organization. Sorry, jumping polls. Before I get to the poll, what you end up doing is and if there are multiple contractors bidding in the project, you can imagine seeing multiple graphs being created, right? Each contractor might end up with a different graph. Maybe contractor A has a really cool modular construction methodology that they want to use on the project. But a real question that I literally have asked a contractor in my past life is, love the modular idea. How does it can you demonstrate this reduces risk on the project? And then, that becomes a slightly harder conversation to have now, and very difficult to arbitrate whether or not there is correctness or truth even in the story there. So back to bidding for realism. So what you want to effectively do is tell the client needs to give the contractor enough assurance and incentive to say, if you provide me with the most realistic outcome for the project, I will fairly apportion the risk for you to take the right amount. But how many clients do you think value certainty of the outcome? So, and we'll flick in just a second, just before Martin takes the screen. Certainty of the outcome is effectively what is the value of finishing a project on a particular date. As an example, we talked about the project in Canada. No, let's come closer to home, in London. London is waiting for Crossrail to begin operations. There is a certain likelihood Crossrail will open on a certain date. And as Crossrail, if I imagine now you're Crossrail and you're providing contracts back in the day, do you think clients will value knowing what is that outcome? It's almost like, I don't know if many people remember this, but Crossrail's, there were billboards all across London. I remember this because I used to live right by Moorgate, and Moorgate Station had the Queen will open this station by the turn of 2018. The turn of 2019. Sorry, and that didn't quite happen, right? So what is the economic value of doing that? And how many clients will actually value that outcome? Because again, if you don't care when your project is going to finish and just say, forget it, you know, the contractor will handle this, they'll figure out when projects should be delivered by, then what I'm saying is probably not going to work very well. So I'd love to hear, how many major clients do you think and value certainty of the outcome when evaluating their bids? So they're thinking about economic value, right? A real estate developer is thinking, when can I get my tenants into the building? An oil and gas client is thinking, when can I start shipping products out of my refinery? I love it. So a few people have never seen this ever happen. I hope this changes with time for you. And I'm also glad to see that we have some, a few, good 6 out of 30, all of them, which means clients, all the clients in 6 people's experience have actually value this. I can tell you from my experience at Shell, is that Shell did it most of the time, right? Most of the time we would calculate the economic return of certainty in project evaluation. And we would provide the contract to the contractor that's like, oh yeah, we know for sure that these guys are going to get it done. And that usually means they're not always the cheapest. But the lion's share of you are either limited to the handfuls or most, but we certainly are nowhere close to all of them being that way, right? And given that this limited to the very few, we have to try and think, just like in the last poll, what do we do about it? And so we're going to keep going down this cascade until you hopefully realize where we get to and some actionable points from there. Whoopsie, sorry. So make it work for the contractor. Maybe controversial to hear, right? That not all clients are thinking out for the contractor's balance sheet. Well, it's slightly obvious that they're not looking out for the contractor's balance sheet. But what very frequently happens is that the contractors, the amount of economic value sitting in the contractor's hands that the client can be influenced by. It's almost like if I knew that, let's find an example in day-to-day life. I mean, here's an example, right? Doctors. Doctors literally hold your life in their hands. They make decisions about your life that could make or break it. And we choose to remunerate them in a certain way. In the same way, if you think about that in a business perspective, which I hope we don't have to enter a discussion about whether all professions in the UK get fairly remunerated. But if you think about this in businesses, right? The value, again, I can reflect personally on my own experiences at Shell. If a contractor didn't deliver the project on time, the effect on Shell was almost always in excess of the entire value of the contract itself, which means we'd rather pay double the price for the same amount of construction, because if we don't do that and we pick some willy-nilly contractor to do the work and then they don't do the work, that would inevitably cost us twice the amount of the construction project itself, which is crazy, right? You think, if I have so much at stake here, why am I not making it work for the contractor? The contractor has been given a contract that they're never going to achieve. They're given margins that they may or may not ever achieve. Just make it work for them. So back to that original graph, the make it work for the contractor theme is around incentivize the contractor to reduce risk. So if you go back to that graph, right, this is what's been submitted, and you think, oh my God, this contractor is awful, right? Then 1% chance of finishing my project on time. This is awful. It might be that all 4 contractors, all 3 contractors that bid on the project are sitting in the same book. So now what? You have no choice but to award it to someone. What you want is the contractor to shift the project to the left. This forecast is adjustable. How do you adjust a forecast? Quite simply, you mitigate risk. And how do you mitigate risk? Well, you listen to what the data is telling you. If the data tells you that these areas of the project are risky, do something about it. And when it's the act of mitigating risk that should be incentivized. And we see this as being a really key part of being able to deliver on these projects. nPlan is in a very fortunate position to get to work with Atkins and SNC-Lavalin at a global level, where we're literally exploring this with a handful of top-notch clients around the world on how can we make it work for the contractor, where the contractor is not just being awarded for, I'm paying you an amount of money to go do the work, but I'm also going to pay you an additional amount of money as you demonstrate to me that you are reducing the risk profile of this project. Why? Simply said, the client makes more money if that happens, right? So take a share of the prize here. This is slightly different incentive mechanisms to what we may have seen previously, such as target cost contracts. And we're going to go to another poll, please. Martin, if you wouldn't mind. So by knowing what risks are ahead of a project, how will the contractor actually act? So back to that original graph, now you've got 1% chance of being on time, and the nPlan algorithms are telling you, or any algorithm really can tell you, these are the things that are going to cause delays on your project. What will happen? How will the contractor now act? Will they just say, screw this, it's going to be a bad outcome anyway. It's almost, we like to think of it as almost, if you show someone where their problems are, how will they react? You could react defensively, but I should stop talking and just look at the data. A key principle of nPlan in itself and this community, right? So almost all of us think that you will be optimistic about the outcome. So if we tell you where all the problems are, if the data tells you where all the problems are, you can take action and do better about it. We don't have a poll for this, but try and think, how would you act if it was not data, meaning if it was the client that was telling you, these are all the risks, go focus on them, or if the contractor's own staff were telling them, these are where I think the risks are. Inevitably, when you see the difference between providing what can be simplified as biased opinions to data, which is hard and true and it cannot be disputed, I'm losing my words today, then you essentially become optimistic about it. There's a natural tendency towards optimism, which is, it's not Bob's opinion that this project is going down the drain. It's actually the data is saying it could go down the drain and this is what might cause it. So let's do something about it. And I'm going to take the screen back, Martin, and take you towards my final slide, which is quite simply a QR code, which you can just take a photograph of that. So I'll leave it here. This QR code takes you to an article that I wrote about this topic in some more detail. If you're interested in learning more about it, we are, as I said, we're literally exploring this concept right now with Atkins, SNC-Lavalin, and a handful of large owner operators. And we are planning to write a much fuller report than literally the words I've been able to use today. And we'll share that with you as soon as it's ready. But you've got the sneak preview already about what does the report really talk about. I suppose the report will give you some more detail on the operational practices that are put in place, like what type of contract are you signing, what clauses are included in contracts, some really gnarly details that would be helpful for more people to bring it to life. But at that, I really prefer if we actually just make it an interactive chat and I can help answer any questions you have.
Well, thank you, Dev. Absolutely superb. A big round of applause for Dev. Thank you. Yeah, cracking stuff, Dev. Loads of insights in there. Thank you very much. If we could get some questions from the audience, please. We've got the first one that's coming from Peter, which says, is bias always bad? Surely it depends on what it's based on. And he said, I've got bias based on experience and knowledge. Does this make it wrong?
No, So, I mean, generally, we all know that we are optimistic beings, right? So is bias bad? No, because if we were not optimistic beings, we probably wouldn't, I mean, Martin wouldn't have set up the community, right? We wouldn't go and build crazy things like spaceports and high-speed railways across crazy countrysides. We wouldn't tunnel under London if we had bias that was pessimistic. The point about, like, it depends on what it's based on, yes. And that is quite literally the point of why you should use data rather than just individual opinions, right? If I've only ever seen, you know, two oil and gas facilities being built in my life, and I get pulled up to go build a third one, you know, I'm not going to be very good at my job, am I? And even if I had spent my entire career building just one type of project, say I became a bridge specialist, would I ever really get enough experience to do this? Like, really think about that. Like, how many bridges get built in the world every single year? And how many of those can one person get to witness? I hope you won't disagree that that number is never going to align. So it doesn't make it wrong. So optimism bias is a great asset to have. Realism as the next layer to that is like, we're optimistic that we can do better, right? I showed you a graph that was awful. That project, based on that graph, is buggered, right? It's horrible economic value there. So we have to be optimistic that you can do better than that and try and beat the algorithm in a certain sense, right? Beat the forecast. We're telling you what to go fix, so beat it. In a certain sense, I'm maybe putting nPlan out of business, that if all the projects listen to everything we said we were going to do, then maybe we don't need a business like nPlan again. But that's a great vision to get to in many, many, many years.
I would say in terms of that bias as well, that's just one bias, which is optimism bias. I think there's about 200 of them. Now, is that you forget about the bad losses that you've had. You know, there's loads and loads of different biases. And what we do as human beings is we aggregate those, and that's the impact of your experience, and that's what you apply. And it's all locked in. And some of that you can compensate for if you can recognize that you are biased on certain things, but it's really hard as a human being. And that's where the data comes in. I think it's worth picking up as well is that if I was a ninja on project management and I'd worked on 10 mega projects in my life, I'd probably be lucky, right, to work on 10. Yeah. So your experience is based on 10 projects. Your data set is based on a lot more. Yeah. And I think that's
a quick question I can take from Jerome on how different is this from schedule risk analysis using PertMaster's Saffron Risk. It's different in two ways. One, it doesn't ask for the opinion of the project team to input, you know, what do you think the risk profiles are per activity? It uses data to do that. So effectively the input is the same. The method to calculate, to simulate risk is a forecasting engine, which is a Monte Carlo simulator, is pretty much the same. There's like hundreds of papers online about how to create a Monte Carlo simulator. I would say there's no IP sitting there, but what you feed in, and of course you've always had garbage in, garbage out. So there we go, that's the difference.
Cool. A question as well, Dev, in terms of understanding what the risks are. So you're talking about the uncertainty windows of certain tasks, so you know that there's a variance distribution on it. How do you take that back to understanding what the risks actually are if you're only looking at schedules?
How do we take the risk into account if we only look at schedules?
Yeah. So if you haven't got a risk register and say, I knew what went wrong. So if you don't know what went wrong, then what can you do to mitigate the risk if you don't know what the risk is? You've only got the variance.
Really good one. You're right. We do not have any causality in our data. We don't know that the project was delayed because of a hurricane or because the site supervisor had a bad mood. We don't know these things. What we do know is the outcome. And we create forecasts based on outcomes. Now, what ends up happening, and we've seen this already on a number of projects where we're live on, is there are sometimes some motherhood statements that come out of the nPlan algorithm, right? One of those motherhood statements recently that we've been dealing with is earthworks in December has a high likelihood of being delayed. And like, you know, you get a slow clap for saying something like that. Everyone on this call knows why that happens, right? We've got snow and you can't, or ice, and you can't pile in ice, generally speaking. But our algorithm doesn't understand that. So when you don't have causality, you are completely reliant on outcome. And that's the beauty of schedule files, is they contain outcomes where they do not contain an outcome. Like the schedule file is just a tender document, and we have no idea how the project actually turned out. We don't include that in our learning. So the algorithms will not learn from that. It only learns from historical completed projects.
Cool. There's a question from Ramin as well, which is about engaging clients to help them build trust in the tools instead of just suspecting it as a black box.
Love the question, Ramin. So Ramin, the way this works, openly, whenever I go to a new client, it is reducing a little bit now, but it's still mostly there. The first thing I'll get from usually a senior person will be like, it's not going to work, right? I'm like, okay, well, let me prove it to you. Let me prove that I can forecast your projects better, more accurately, and more reliably than anything you can imagine. And then at that point, the risk's on me, right? Either my thing works or it doesn't work. The way we do it then is we tell the companies we work with, hold back 20% or 10% of your schedule data. Don't show it to us. It's going to be the magic test. We'll pretend nPlan existed inside your business 6 years ago. We'll upload the original baseline of one of those hidden projects, and we'll forecast it. And you know what happened to the project. So you can literally check, did the forecast work? Is the outcome within forecast and the activities? And that's how you engage clients. That's how you get them to get over the fact that it is actually kind of black boxy. I mean, even for us, it's a bit black boxy. But you have confidence that it's been tested in a rigorous and understandable way that makes it relatable. Then the second part to that is obviously just use it. Just use it on your projects and you'll get a feeling for how this thing reacts, which is the next part to like longer term engagement.
It's a question from Paul about, it just moved up the chain there. I've lost it now. You got it, Dev? In terms of project data that is being fed into the algorithm, what steps do you take to ensure that the data is clean and not manipulated to make teams look good?
Yeah, we spend a huge amount of time doing this in our data set. We have a couple of billion activities that we read, of which we'll only learn from, I think the numbers are less than 30% of it, which means 70% of the data gets, call it, discarded or gets used for auxiliary reasons. In the filtering process, so we have really tight filters, which is like, if, for example, you have a project schedule where every single thousands of activities are just marked as on time, I mean, you don't need a PhD to figure out that there's something funky about that project. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different filtering mechanisms that we can use. We do have algorithms that can detect error, algorithms that can detect fraud. We have all of these things built in even before the main act begins. So it's like really heavy. We still spend hundreds of hours because we keep discovering new ways. Humans are crafty beings when it comes to scheduling, and it's a fun job just finding out all the different ways that this can happen.
Cool. In terms of your algorithms across other industries as well, so it's just based on construction, on some mega projects at the moment. Could you use it elsewhere?
Perhaps.
Could you use it in financial services, for instance, on some big regulatory projects?
Maybe sounds like a bit of a wet blanket, but I don't think so. And the only reason I don't think so is, I mean, our system is essentially just based on data, right? If you have data on detailed data on projects, and if that project is in the financial services industry of what was planned to happen, what actually happened, and it is in a scheduled format, meaning it's a Gantt chart, and it's at scale, then sure, we can learn it. But from the few conversations that I've had, our friends at Shark Tower, Craig at Shark Tower, who's doing some awesome work there, for us, it's a no. Like we don't know where this data is, or it's too spread out to centralize.
Okay.
In construction, it's basically all P6. So Peter Gross asked that question: are you feeding in P6 data sets? Yeah. Out of the 450 something thousand schedule files we have, like close to 80% of it is P6.
Peter said, have you got any real examples that demonstrate the strength of your forecasts?
Yeah, go to our website. We've got some case studies up there now. We did one in, I've forgotten. Oh yeah, it's a rail project in the UK, a very significant electrification project. One in Western Australia, a liquefaction plant in Western Australia, and then yeah, so those are the written case studies. We obviously can't write the case studies up of some of the projects we're currently working on, but yeah.
Cool. So if you'd like to come off mute now, if you've got any questions for Dev, please pose them. And while they're doing that, Dev, if I could ask one, we've got this panel event coming up, talk about the impact of project data analytics on the project controls function. What's your take on that?
I think the project controls function is going to move towards a function where their purpose is to effectively decide. It's a function of action rather than analysis. So what I think we'll see less and less of is, so for example, actually this morning, I was on a call with a client. They're a very, very large owner operator in the UK. And it was like 7 people from their project controls team. And they, we were talking about some of the work we're doing together, and they were like, I'm sorry, Dev, we really have to go. I don't think we're going to get time to do our actions by the next meeting, which is next week. Could we push it to the week after that? And I was like, why? I mean, it literally is going to take you 5 minutes to do the actions we need. And they're like, it's the end of month reporting cycle for us. I was like, what? So you mean you're going to, 7 of you, or probably more than 7 of you, are going to spend an entire week doing a reporting cycle? What does that even mean? So that's the kind of stuff that I hope they don't have to keep doing, right? For the sake of them. I hope that rather than that, it's like the report is created somehow using algorithms, using whatever it takes, right? I couldn't care. I don't really care how you produce the report. If I was a project controls function, I care about the actions that should then be ensued after that, like having the discussions with the team, telling the welding team that, hey, you're on track here. If you keep going in this way, this is where you're going to end up. Be predictive to all elements of the projects, and to really share that wider, right? If you try and recall, how are project controls people perceived in major projects? Sometimes they're just policemen, people that are seen up in the tower that, it's like they don't know actually what's happening on the project. And those are the things that I really hope will shift.
Cool. And if people want to come off mute, if you've got any questions, please chip in. Anybody? And the skill sets as well. Do you see the skill sets evolving, Dev, becoming more and more conversant with AI and applying this stuff? Because I see that with the guys we're working on through the academy, is there's some people who's really enthusiastic about this and saying, if I don't pick these skills up, I'm not going to be able to understand what you're telling them. And in terms of that reporting stuff, right, where they have got to free up bandwidth, they've got to be able to use Power BI automation, do natural language queries on their sort of analysis, etc. And it means they become a different sort of person, right? It's a different role, it's a different job, basically. Are you finding that? Is that what's coming your way?
Yes. I completely understand. I mean, it's the whole point of the apprenticeships, right? Which is such a great initiative you have, is to make sure the next generation do actually understand how to do this themselves. Because nPlan operates in this like incredibly niche and deep place, and really we're sitting at the tip of an iceberg, if you want to use that analogy. there's so much. There's so much low-hanging fruit. Like, I mean, you see it in your project hacks, right? That's why you're on project hack 7. If there was no low-hanging fruit, you'd have finished after project hack 1, and they'd be like, all right, we're done now. I don't think you're ending at 7. So yes, to your question of there's tons of opportunity there. I also, from my perspective, from nPlan's perspective, my mission is to empower everyone to be able to understand it. You shouldn't need to understand how Power BI works or how machine learning works or how, I mean, all you need to know is how to use a mouse and a keyboard, and that's good enough, right? And that's hard. It's really, really hard to communicate some of these concepts in a way that is applicable to a really wide audience. But it's a wicked problem that I have a lot of passion to try and solve for, because if you can bring in those people, right, then you're not expecting them to like, here's Power BI, go figure it out, which, you know, that would be scary. You're simply giving them the information so they can do something about it, and they can focus on the job that they do best, right? Which probably may not be analytics. So there are two camps here, right? You do need a bigger camp in analytics. You also need things to just become simpler. If anyone's used P6 in this audience, it's tough stuff, man. Even I struggle. Like, I'm fairly good with software, and it's really hard to figure out how to use these things.
Cool.
That way.
Anybody else? Any questions from anyone? There must be somebody who wants to come off mute and ask a question.
Yeah. I've got a question if I jump the queue.
We've got 3 there, I think. So Ramin goes first, and then I think it was Peter, and then Warren by the look of it. So Ramin, go for it.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Dev, for the interesting talk. You mentioned earlier that the models that you run don't sort of take into account causality because just the sort of data doesn't lend itself to that, which makes sense. Have you come across there's sort of a lot of work recently on causal modeling, and do you think there is scope to apply that in the industry?
I think so. You know, there basically is just a ton of good work in lots of these areas. I mean, Nodes and Links does some really cool modeling as well, right? Complexity modeling, to name one that I know at the top of my head. Whether nPlan's work can interact with those, I don't know is the honest answer. And the only reason I remain slightly ignorant is because my principle is basically to focus. And Martin knows this because I said it in my first talk, I said it in my second talk, and which is I'm a ninja at just going into one thing and becoming the master of it, right? And I've charted nPlan into that territory as well. And often what ends up happening is that we've had tons of opportunity, like, oh, if you could do this and this, that'd be even better. And I'm like, probably.
Yeah.
But that's not my thesis.
I think as well that the data's not there today, in my view, about causality. So
I haven't seen it, yeah.
You know, I've been preaching about lessons learned for ages, saying, you know, we just aggregate data and roll it up. What we actually should be looking at is narrating variance in the graph that Greg uses in Nodes and Links. So you've got a graph analysis of why you got the variance in the first place, and that feeds into your algorithm, and you knit it together, and you start to drill into that causality. That's when we'll get there. But I think we're just lacking the data models at the moment and the connected nature of the data. But I think it's going to come. You know, I think it's all possible if we glue it together. So, you know, maybe next 2 or 3 years. Peter. I think it was Peter who asked the question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Martin. Yeah, to be honest, it was hi, Dev. We only connected on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago. I'm one of the small fish at the other end of the pond where I'm dealing with project management tools, which may be what Martin just talked about, which is the feeder into something like yours. But I'm focused in the IT sector, typically in the finance industry. So my tool is what I define as actionable intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. The my main question was really about how, and I'm not familiar with them, so apologies. Nodes and links. How do you differentiate yourself? How do you position yourself against those guys? Because aren't they trying to do the same sort of thing in the highly complex project arena, whether it be construction or submarines or whatever it was that they're after?
So, I mean, it's more than just nodes and links that does stuff in the, call it analytics in the complex project space. Specifically, we use historical data to drive our forecasts, and as far as I know, no one else does that.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to go and ask the nodes and links guys how they're doing their stuff then. So, but thank you. It's interesting talk and good to meet you. Thank you.
I think the difference is, I think that they're looking more at graph analytics and using that to understand your near neighbours on your critical path and things like that. So they can run algorithms that say, there's your critical path. If this thing goes wrong, then it's going to be on your critical path fairly quickly. And dev stuff is more about, you know, forecasting and the probability sort of distribution of the end dates. So they do different things. I think over time there might be some overlap, but I think at the moment they are separate from what I can make out.
Nice to see that you've got at least one sponsor that is backing both of you as well.
Yeah, it's cool. I think, you know, both of them doing really well. And you came from the same place as well, didn't you, Dev?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. And there's a few more as well. So there's Contilio, who came from the same place. They're doing stuff a bit like build dots, where you go around with the camera on your hat, integrates it with BIM. You can then look at the variance in your model between the plan and actual, because you go around and you can see that a wall's missing when it should be there. So you can then feed that back into your schedule, which is pretty cool. And there is a Qflow as well that came out of Entrepreneurs First that's doing some cool stuff on sustainability. So this is a jigsaw puzzle. It's not just a project management, artificial intelligence, and Dev's doing it. Oh, yeah. He's got a niche, and there's lots of other people that's got a niche, and we need to integrate all that together, and that'll solve the problem.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I think Warren asked the question as well. Did you, Warren?
Yeah, hi. Dev, good to meet you. I'm just finishing a dissertation at the moment, which is trying to address some of what you've been speaking about today. I just wondered if it was okay, firstly, if
sorry, I use your question there. Yes, by all means.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And Martin, same question. Yeah, awesome. Okay, thank you. I mean, and just to say, I'm focusing on very similar things, but coming at it from a different perspective. I'm looking at the visibility of data, visibility of project performance, but also behaviours of all parties in a contract or in a project, and trust levels, and how you actually get a better means of addressing what all of that looks like in a broader sense of a project, and the framework in which, therefore, the project actors are operating. And all of that is with the intention of trying to challenge people to start putting contract forms and project forms together that are more collaborative and enabling a seamless transfer of data without the filters of what's going on at each level, corrupting the truth of the data. So I'm hoping to share that with you soon. I just wanted to make sure I was okay citing the good work that you guys are doing now. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All good. Thank you.
Cool. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Go for it, Ken.
I'm a planner, so I really feel for you on looking at time. But do you also look at cost? I mean, we're outnumbered about 10 to 1 QSs to planners on projects that I've been on, and the QSs become the commercial managers and run the companies. So how do we get the cost data into this sort of thing too? Because time, nobody really cares about time. They only care about money, and how time converts to money is what's important.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I can be very direct. nPlan does not do any cost modeling. And maybe I'm missing the biggest trick in the book, as you say, that yes, people do care about money over time. I agree. I've been there myself, right? Where you keep asking about what's the cost estimate, and then someone says, oh, but you also want to see the schedule. Like, yeah. Show me the cost estimate. The big problem of cost estimates is the lack of standardization. We don't have the equivalent of P6. What P6 is to schedules, what is it to cost estimates? And maybe I've missed the biggest trick in the book, but I haven't been able to find that level of standardization just yet. I will disagree with you in one part though, which is that time is money, and we literally have the data to prove that, right?
Yeah.
So if your project doesn't, I mean, actually I'm not allowed to share the numbers, but we recently saw the numbers of what high speed 2 will cost for every week it is delayed. And I promise you the number is berserk, right? And even in the smaller sections of high speed 2, it's just bonkers numbers in the indirect costs, not direct costs. So just in your indirects, you look at time value, like every week you take longer to deliver this project, how much will you spend in basically labor? And it's outstanding, right? So if you divide cost into two things, oversimplifying cost management by a whole order of magnitude here, and cost is basically only two things, which is materials and everything else. And in everything else, you have the heaviest weight of everything else is time. And if you don't have time modeled correctly, which is something we think we help with a lot, then you're never going to get that. We do have a lot of clients that take the schedule modeling that is done and then apply it to their cost models. So you can take one and manually bridge the gap, right? That's maybe what Martin was saying, where you do need people that are somewhat good at analytics to combine these two things and then get some really insightful things out of that. But as nPlan, we don't touch costs.
Yeah. I think as well, in terms of those bonkers costs that you've seen as well, Dev, with the indirect costs, I bet you there's a big chunk of costs as well in terms of benefits. And it's like Crossrail. When it's late with Crossrail, they've lost all that ticket revenue. So then TfL runs up some massive debts. All those people who's moved house expecting now to jump on a train and get into work and they can't, you know, and all those other things, there's macroeconomic impacts of it. And once people start to understand that through graph technology, sort of consequences of these delays is going to be really scary. Anybody else?
See Martin Hooper, raise the hand.
Yeah,
Martin,
sorry.
go for it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you've already answered this or not, but I just wondered if there's some industries out there that are actually doing this right. And like, have you got comparisons with sort of like rail, aviation, highways, to think that these sectors are doing it well, these sectors are doing it poorly? Are there trends in that, or is it just kind of bad everywhere?
So in construction, we have data to show that the oil and gas industry is slightly better than heavy infrastructure, and we have data that shows rail is better than water and water is better than road. So now you sort of get what's the bottom of the food chain. And this is quite simply an ability to plan and execute well. Did that answer your question, Martin?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you.
I think it's worth adding to that as well, Dev, is that I've been speaking to some people in Highways England, and if you think about their big projects, you know, the mega projects, if they can start to pull that data from one job to the next job to the next job to the next job, and they then say to industry, right, your job is to do a better job than previously, building upon all that data you've got. That's a different commercial model again, right? It's a different way of bidding. And that's something I'm going to be talking about in a couple of weeks' time, is that where does that lead to? Right, we start to break a lot of traditional models.
Yeah.
And this is coming. I can tell you now, this is coming. I've been speaking to some people, and it's in the pipe.
Yeah, literally
So,
what I said, right? I mean, Highways England are also part of this conversation that we're having, which is around bidding for realism.
Yeah,
how do you incentivize bidding for realism? You've got all this data, you can do these analytics, and then how do you incentivize the contractors to do that, right? You can't just tell them, we need you to bid for realism, and we need you to use your data, right? You actually have to put cash on the table for it. Money speaks. It doesn't matter if you like that or not, or if capitalists don't like that or not. Money will speak in this industry and always will. It's just about putting it on the table to make that investment to happen.
Cool. Anybody else? We'll do one more question and then we'll draw stumps, I think, Dev. Anybody want to come off mute? Nope, nobody else? 5, For
if no one else is going to go on just before we finish the question, sorry, yeah. In terms of, I think it was the planning and obviously execution. Did you say rail was the best in terms of the construction industry?
Energy.
Energy, wow, that's a big shock. I work in the industry, so so I thought the rail would be the best. So anyways, I solved that one then.
So what sort of numbers would you put on it? I've seen Oxford numbers in terms of performance from Alex Budzier. You know, he says if you've got solar panel projects, they're largely on time and on cost, and if you've got the Olympics, they're dreadful. And he's got a range in between. Have you got similar figures to that?
Always on time, right? That's the only mega project in the world that is always delivered on time.
Yeah.
And Budzier knows that one. I think he's the one who said that. So we have a slightly different metric called Project Performance Index. We want to we're struggling a little bit with permissions here, but we want to publish an index on performance. So performance is basically this concept of saying you plan to do this and then you actually do this. And the minimum, we consider a high performing project equals a boring project where they just did what they said they were going to do. And then you lots of claps for you, right? You didn't accelerate. Those that accelerate, by the way, are bad projects. So ironically, the rail industry has tons of accelerating projects and they get bad marks according to nPlan, because accelerating is also not as good as is not a very good thing to do, because you're putting money on the table, leaving money on the table. So at the moment, I'm in a very detailed and fierce battle about permission to be able to publish this kind of information. As you'd imagine, if we publish information about rail and we only have one rail customer, well, then I've just suddenly attributed it. So that's the hard thing, but I'm confident we'll get there.
Cool. Yeah. So you could just clarify that thing about accelerating. Sorry, Dev. Why do you think that's a bad thing?
So if you deliver your project earlier than you said you were going to deliver it, then effectively you've still just not planned it very well. Yeah. There was money left on the table. So if you imagine it as a commercial building and tenants were supposed to move in, they could have moved in earlier, but now the building is vacant because you did better than you thought you were going to do. That's it's not as bad as late, right? Being late is worse, but being early is not a gold star.
Cool.